Hello, my name is Camille Suro, and I'm a graduate student in this course. So for the presentation requirement, I decided to kind of just do like a speech video, go over the article that I wrote my paper on, discuss what the authors went through, kind of give like a brief summary of it, and then also go over like my critique of it and discuss how it addresses the roots of sex trafficking and human trafficking. So the article that I did my paper on is the one that's called Decreasing Human Trafficking Through Sex Work Decriminalization. This one was by Erin Albright and Kate Diadamo. It was from last week, so that would be week 4. It's kind of a shorter piece. It was only like, I think, 3 or 4 pages, but it still offered a lot of insight on the topic of decriminalizing sex work, so I thought that was awesome. So kind of just to like go ahead and get started, I'm first going to just summarize what the article stated and what the authors went over. So pretty much what was going on here was an assessment of a decriminalization model policy that was released in 2016 by Amnesty International. And what the authors are proposing is the need to stop the criminalization of sex work in order to better protect the health and human rights of sex workers. The authors discuss the implications of this model policy, and they kind of specifically direct their message toward healthcare workers, which I thought was interesting. And then they break down their argument into 4 separate reasonings. In particular, I'm going to be addressing one of them, kind of critiquing it. And then towards the end, again, I'll kind of discuss what I thought was done well. So the model policy that Amnesty International designed relies on the distinction that decriminalization is less focused on prosecuting all aspects of sex work, and rather it's supposed to be centered on the importance of enforcing policies that provide greater social and economic protections for sex workers so that exploitation can be prevented. As stated in the article, the decriminalization policy is not only supported by numerous social organizations and alliances worldwide, but also by the community of those involved in trading sex. So one critique that I had here was that it's kind of unclear what those involved in trading sex means or who it refers to. I kind of question, like, okay, are those involved in trading sex, does that mean voluntary sex workers, or does that mean, could it mean like victims of sex trafficking? While it may be assumed that victims support decriminalization, I think it's important to explicitly phrase it that way to indicate that both victims of trafficking and voluntary sex workers support this decriminalization model to kind of ensure that proper recognition is given to victims. So in my mind, I think that incorporating this inclusive language kind of like adds a level of credibility to the application of the decriminalization model. Just being that if both sex workers and victims think that this model has real life potential and being successful, it adds more appeal and reinforces why countries should consider adopting the model. So that was kind of the first thing that I said. And then just moving forward, the next thing that I wanted to talk about is one of the arguments that the authors discuss as to why the decriminalization model should be followed. The first mentioned reason that they go over as to why we should oppose criminalization is that it increases opportunities for violence that are unable to be reported to the police because it implicates the sex workers for participating in criminal activity that they fear legal consequences. So they're kind of stuck in this vicious cycle that ends up perpetuating more violence. They're scared of getting in trouble, so they choose to seek work elsewhere, usually in a hidden or isolated environment, which then ends up putting them in a more dangerous spot than where they started. I thought that all of that was valid, but at the same time, I kind of felt like they left out a population while describing this. So after reading that, the question that I proposed is, well, what about sex workers that live in non-democratic areas of the world where the law is guided by tradition or religion, and committing certain crimes results in corporal punishment or death? I'm thinking of countries like in Africa or in the Middle East or in Asia, etc. So something to contemplate is that sex workers or victims who fall into this category probably face an even deeper level of confliction when stuck in the position of wanting to report exploitation to law enforcement, but feeling like they can't. Um, while sex workers or victims of trafficking in countries like America have the dilemma of not wanting to approach law enforcement due to fear of legal consequences, they ultimately do not face the reality of being like stoned to death or publicly executed by their government for admitting to being involved in sex work. So pretty much I think like regardless of what country we're talking about, if sex workers or victims don't report to law enforcement, like yes, they're going to experience perpetuated violence from either their traffickers or from the environment that they're forced into. However, the article kind of failed to elaborate on the fact that where these people live geographically can significantly make the circumstances even worse. I pretty much what I thought was that the article presented this particular struggle of sex workers in like a westernized fashion, like they only considered this struggle for sex workers in democratic societies, if that makes sense. That was kind of my take on it. Um, and apart from that, the last thing that I wanted to go over was just some positive attributes of the piece. So I thought that their last argument, which talked about the stigma that surrounds sex work, I was just like glad that they mentioned that. In my opinion, I think that stigma alone is one of the greatest contributors as to why there is a need for decriminalization. So I thought that it was awesome that the authors made a point to go over stigma towards sex workers. And I think that that pretty much addresses the roots of human trafficking because they're taking into account things like race, discrimination, class, and how all of those things play into societal views of sex workers. Um, so yeah, that was pretty much everything. Overall, I thought this was a well-written piece. Although I did have a few critiques, I still think that they offered an interesting perspective, and that it's just important to remember that the topic of sex work and human trafficking is obviously super sensitive and complex, and that there's no way to like perfectly discuss it in one single article. So they did a good job of attempting to do that.